I was rummaging through an attic over the weekend to find some of my dad's work, and I found this, a house analysis, and it was for Architecture 272 in June 1st, 1957. An analysis of the contemporary house by R.M. Greenberg, architect. My father grew up in a colonial house on Kings Road in West Hollywood, California, so some would say that's not an auspicious beginning for a modern architect, but his neighbor was Schindler, and that inspired him to take the course that he did. So in a couple slides, and I'm not an architect, that's a big caveat, and I'm not going to analyze his architecture. I just want to give you a sense of what he was about and what he did in Southern California.
Yeah, just forward.
Good. Terrific. So that's his first work, or one of his first works here at SC. My dad's initial work were for family and friends, not surprisingly. This is a structure close to UCLA, the Dohan residence. Picture of my dad, the young architect. I can say that he was not just motivated by Schindler, he was also motivated by the book, The Fountainhead, and that's become a bit of a cliche, not necessarily from a political point of view, but more from the spirit of being a vigorously independent architect. His parents, his father had an 8th grade education, grew up in poverty, started 3 companies that were traded on the New York Stock Exchange, and one was called Standard Brands Paint Company, which was the forerunner to Home Depot. In fact, Home Depot put it out of business. My dad respected his father from a business point of view, but he referred to Standard Brand stores, and there were 120 of them in the United States, as, quote, a blight on the landscape. He was not a fan of the architecture, the lack thereof, surrounding his father's business. So this was showing his dad what could be done. This is a home in Bel Air, California. And the interior shop, my dad picked the furniture. He made the furniture, oftentimes not that furniture, but a real connoisseur of the modern look. This was an office building still on Westwood Boulevard in Los Angeles. It's been fixed up. It looks gorgeous today. But that housed his father's office when he retired from Standard Brands Paint, and also my dad and his young firm, Flores, Gelman, and Greenberg, all graduates of this program. And some of them are going to be around tonight for cocktails if you guys are around. Picture of the young architect. This is a school somewhere in Southern California for special ed. This is a house on the Maria Peninsula. And one of my dad's claims to fame was that he identified this barren strip of sand. There was a lot of tumbleweeds and neglected oil fields, and all of a sudden, amazing structures of wood, glass, and concrete emerged. This is one of his first projects. This was a house I grew up in, so you can tell it was a very difficult environment to grow up in, a real hardship case of me being a kid in this gorgeous 5-split level home on the beach with my sister Laura. This was our living room. So everything was picked with precision. This was not just, the perfection was everywhere, right? Soon thereafter, at that time, my dad built a series with his partners of large apartment complexes on the peninsula. Notice they were barren on both sides. There was nothing being built around there. If you go there now, these are out of everyone's price range. They're still standing, and most of it refurbished in a very nice way. Interior shop. My dad was an absolute fan that every single space had to have an ocean front view. And if you look at his architecture, I'll show you a bit in a moment, he was loyal to that credo. Side view, another view, and you can see it's dated for the cars, but on the other hand, the architecture I'd like to think is more timeless. This was probably his most ambitious project. It's now a residential high-rise that has beautiful apartments. In fact, a friend of my dad's has one of those apartments on the top floor, but my dad would probably be sad that the stainless steel, the concrete, the teak wood has now all been covered up and whitewashed. He liked the way the interiors turned out, but that's a work of art that's been tampered with. Part of the inspiration of this was to revitalize the canal system in Venice. If any of you are interested, by the way, I have slides after slides after slides of what they intended to do with the canals, and still to this day have not been done. Hotel in Mexico, Guaymas, Sonora. Again, the bougainvillea, the concrete, and everyone gets an ocean view. That work inspired him to take some time off. No secret, if you built 8 of those mega apartment buildings on the beach, he had the resources at 32 to, quote, in his words, retire. So retiring meant cruising through Baja California before Baja California was, in my dad's words, effed up. Before it was effed up. I was a 9-year-old, I lived on the boat with him. He came back to Los Angeles and to his Venice roots, and rather than creating from scratch, he was very intent on engaging in gentrification. So here's a project on Pacific Avenue, before, after, that still stands to this day. I think my dad was very innovative in many ways, including artist-in-residence spaces. He was doing this in the 1980s before it became popular. While going to a university that I will not name across town as an undergraduate, I lived in one of these spaces. And my dad worked down below. So my little perch loft was upstairs, and this was in a time where architects still drew. My dad died in '93, but yet he experimented a little bit with CAD design, but it wasn't, it was still too early at that time. This is a project next to Tony Bill's, is that restaurant still around, Laura? On Market Street, 72 Market Street? Still around in Venice? Okay, so my dad was partners with Tony on some real estate. This is a piece that he did right next to 72 Market Street. This is one of my favorite works that he did. It's on Innis Place. The guy who owns it is a big fan of my dad's architecture. The interior space is spectacular. He built this from scratch, and this was completed in like 91, 92, a year before he died. And we also had office space in there for a time. There's a wide variety of work that my dad did. And my dad believed that good architects only become great at 60 and above. He died at 55. So his work, you can see, kind of took different turns here, and I'll give an example in a moment. But this is an interior space, Maple Drive, Beverly Hills Stop Restaurant, for many, many years. Turns, arches, again, I'm not the architect, and I'm not even a student thereof. However, you can see he departed a bit from the modernist world in terms of creating structures that were indigenous, and indigenous is probably not the right word, but in Venice, as you guys know, a lot of arches, a lot of stuff like that, so we wanted to do something that would fit in. This structure is still there to this day, blending commercial with residential. Here's this last project. A little ironic that I show you a bicycle path, because my dad was, although a sports enthusiast, he was vehemently opposed to pouring concrete on Virgin Beach sand. In fact, he went up against the Coastal Commission many times, and because of my dad, the bike path doesn't stretch all the way down from Anchorage, Buccaneer, Catamaran. If you know the peninsula, it stops right there in Washington, in large part because of his efforts. So this was actually built in Santa Monica. It's his last structure. It's a beautiful space, and he never saw it completely finished. He did have the heartache of dealing with different aspects of this job, but that's the last work I wanted to show you. I want to just conclude in just a minute. Just like a lot of great architects, some of their best work is never actually built. Okay? So I want to give you a couple examples of that. This was a hotel for Regent International in Palm Springs that was very, very close to being built. Didn't happen. I have all the designs for it. It would have been spectacular and very much ahead of its time. Wilshire Boulevard. Remember, now you drive down Wilshire by that unnamed school that I went to. I'm trying to be a little funny. It's in my daughter's honor. I was at UCLA. That's the confession. I confess I was at UCLA this morning at the School of Theater, Television, and Film. My daughter we live in New York City. She's an aspiring comedic writer, and we went to get a tour of their school. So we're driving up Wilshire, and now you see all these high-rises. At a time, it was just funky old motels, etc. This was a structure that he designed back in the late 70s to transform Wilshire Boulevard. It didn't happen. Avid sailor, hated powerboats. He was a purist. Remember, kind of the Howard Rourke motif. So this was a boat that he designed. One-room vacation home in Maui. So again, this is in Hana on the other side. How many of you have been to Hana? Show of hands, right? So my dad loved Hana in part because it wasn't effed up, indigenous, real, etc. And he wanted to get a sense of that, have people experience that. This was never built. Unfortunately, when my dad died, financially we had to sell off land that we owned in Hawaii, so it wasn't built, but maybe one day in some other place, maybe even now. There's other work that he designed that I don't have the time to show you. One was a house in Malibu on Point Dume that is just, I mean, the land that he picked there is absolutely priceless, and it was a gorgeous house. Again, was not designed. Give you a sense of what he looked like. Style, aesthetic was very important to him in many, many ways. But yet he wasn't, despite the Hollywood looks, he was not flamboyant. He was not pretentious. He didn't wear jewelry. He didn't shout. He wasn't loud. He was a sensitive soul, a loving person, and a true artist who believed in the practice of architecture. Speaking of aesthetic, he picked a very scenic locale to be buried in. This was across from our land in Maui. He is buried a stone's throw away from Charles Lindbergh. This is in Kipahulu, which is even further into Maui, for those of you that have done the Hana Drive. And it looks out on that gorgeous, gorgeous view. The irony, of course, of him being buried at Charles Lindbergh is that there's a Star of David on my dad's tombstone, which appropriately enough he designed himself, right? He was functioning to the last minute. He died at 6 Boyd Street, looking at the boats and the structure that he designed. He would never be in some hospital. And what he says, on his tombstone is "Remember me." So that's what we're doing here today. So it's an honor. I think the irony of Lindbergh, being buried next to a Jew, Lindbergh was known sometimes to harbor negative feelings towards Jews and other minority groups. So we like to joke that Lindbergh's turning over in his grave. Or there was a real estate broker that answers the question, "What's this Tony Greenberg doing being buried next to Charles Lindbergh?" And the real estate agent jokes, "Well, it was his dentist." Online, it's amazing how people still live. This is my second to last slide. We were doing a search the other day, just typing in my dad's name, and up comes some of his architecture next to Neutra and Frank Lloyd Wright, and I just think my dad would be so humbled and so honored, and as a family, we're thrilled that his name can exist amongst the legends of architecture. Not that he was legendary at all, but I do think that had he lived longer, his work would have only gotten more inspiring. And finally, the tenant at Innis Place, who became the owner of Innis Place, who sent Laura and myself an email this morning, on his own inspiration created this bio for my dad. Appropriately enough, it is in cardinal and gold, in case you didn't notice. And up above, you can read the credo that my dad had, which, if I can just read it, and I'll conclude with that. I believe the art of architecture to be the thoughtful crafting of buildings would satisfy the needs of the client while incorporating materials and forms indigenous to the particular locale, utilizing at the same time the most current available technology, apropos for your conversation today, to produce spaces whose fundamental purpose is to stimulate and uplift the spirit of those they serve. So on that note, we're inspired by what you're doing here today and honored to listen in. Thank you very much.